The voicemail ended, and I just sat there in my truck with the engine ticking under the hood and my coffee cooling between my hands. My name is Yolanda Doyle. I'm 33 years old, and that morning my father told me by voicemail that I was no longer part of the family. I played it once. I didn't play it again. His voice was flat in that way people get when somebody else is standing nearby, and they're trying to sound braver than they feel. Underneath his words, faint and blurred, I could hear Sharon saying something in the background. "You're out. Don't come back. We're done here. We're moving forward without you." I stared at my phone for a long time after it ended. Then I typed back one word. "Okay." What none of them remembered, while they were so busy deciding to move on without me, was that I was the one person holding the keys to everything they were standing on. By the next morning, I had 46 missed calls. I'll get to those. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quiet ones don't shout, they document. And where sometimes the cleanest boundary leaves the deepest bruise. If you've ever been the one carrying the weight of a whole family, only to find out they saw you as useful instead of loved, then stay with me, because this one turns hard and clean. Comment below if you've ever had to choose peace over blood, and subscribe if you want more stories where calm people stop explaining themselves. So let me back up. I run a little bookkeeping and tax office on Main Street in Harmons Mill, Ohio. Population just under 4,000, depending on whose grandson moved back in and whose daughter moved out after high school. I do payroll for the feed store, quarterly filings for 2 churches, farm books for half the county, and enough tax returns every spring to know exactly how panic sounds when it walks through a door pretending to be calm. People come to me when the letters from the IRS start arriving in thick envelopes. They come when a business partner vanishes, when the equipment loan doesn't match the receipts, when somebody has been handling the books, and now nobody can explain where $12,000 went. I'm the person who reads the fine print slowly, out loud, until the truth shows itself. Turns out my own family had been off balance for a long time. I learned numbers the hard way. I was 20 when my mother got sick the first time. I left school and drove her to Columbus 3 times a week for treatment, 90 minutes each direction, a thermos in the cup holder and paperwork stacked between us. I learned trusts, tax law, hospital billing, insurance appeals, and the difference between what people say a document means and what it actually means when a judge reads it. My mother's name was Carol. She had soil permanently set into the lines of her hands and a mind sharp enough to catch a mistake before most people had even found the total. She used to tell me that numbers are merciful because they don't flatter anybody. A ledger won't lie just because a person is hurt. A contract won't get softer because somebody starts crying over dinner. When the cancer came back the second time, she sat me down at the kitchen table and made me trustee of the family trust. Not my father. Me. The trust held the farm. 160 acres, the old farmhouse, the back field, the windbreak, the row of oak trees she planted the year I was born, and enough history in the ground to make selling it feel like amputating something living. Back then, I thought she picked me because I was organized, because I read every page, because I was the one who knew where every document was filed and which lawyer to call. I didn't understand she was doing more than choosing the careful child. I didn't understand she was choosing the one person she believed would hold the line when everybody else wanted comfort. I found that out 2.5 years later. My mother died on a Tuesday in October, and my father came apart in a way I had not prepared for. Roy Doyle had been married to her for 36 years. He didn't know how to make coffee without her. He didn't know which bills were on auto pay, where she kept the property tax notices, which pills he took after supper, or how often the furnace filter needed changing. Grief hollowed him out so fast it frightened me. For nearly a year after she died, I drove the 12 miles out to the farm every other day just to keep his life from tipping over. I sorted the mail. I refilled prescriptions. I sat with him through holiday dinners, where nobody could say her name without the room going soft. I balanced his checkbook. I fixed the insurance renewal. I stood in the pantry and made lists on the back of seed catalogs, because that was what daughters do when they love someone who cannot stand up by himself. And for a while, I didn't mind. Under the grief, he was still my dad. Toward the end, my mother had said something to me that I didn't understand then. She told me her worst fear wasn't dying. It was leaving him lonely with land. She said a lonely man with acreage is the easiest mark in the world. I told myself she was tired, talking out of fear, letting the medicine do what medicine does. Then he met Sharon. They met at a church potluck 2 counties over, married 13 months after my mother's funeral, fast enough that some people still had condolence cards tucked on the mantle. Sharon Voss was 54, twice divorced, polished in a way our town never quite trusted, and friendly with that special kind of friendliness that feels less like warmth and more like inventory. She moved into the farmhouse. 3 weeks later, her grown son Brett moved in too. He took my old room, stacked motorcycle parts on the porch, and acted like the place had always belonged to him. I tried to be glad for my father. I really did. A lonely man had found company again, and in theory, that should have been a blessing. But something in him changed that winter, and it took me months to admit what I was seeing. He started making little comments. "Your mother trusted you more than me, I guess. Funny, isn't it, being a guest on your own land? You've got more say around here than I do." He said them lightly, with a little laugh, but not lightly enough. And every single time, Sharon never argued, never corrected him, never said, "No, Roy, that's not fair." She would just let the silence sit there and ripen. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me while I brought over the quarterly trust statements. Not angry. Not friendly. Just measuring. I should have measured back. The house in town was Sharon's dream. By spring, she had listings printed and stacked in a neat pile. By early summer, she had one favorite, a 4-bedroom place on Cedar Street with a wide front porch and a big kitchen window she said reminded her of her childhood. Asking price, $240,000. Their plan was simple. Sell the back 40. Use the proceeds and my promised contribution to buy the house. Only the back 40 wasn't theirs to sell. It belonged to the trust, which meant, legally speaking, it belonged to my mother's instructions. And I was the one holding the pen. I didn't want a war, so I bent farther than I should have. I told them I would contribute $60,000 of my own money toward the down payment as a gift. No strings, just a gift. I said I'd also consider a partial sale of acreage if we did it properly, a real appraisal, notice to beneficiaries, documentation, trust review, everything clean enough that nobody could come back years later and say the sale had been mishandled. That wasn't me being difficult. That was me doing the job. I even called Gwen Hollies, the attorney who had drawn up the trust with my mother, and asked her to start the process the right way. But Sharon didn't hear careful. She heard delay. One evening over pot roast, she slid a stack of papers toward me like she was passing biscuits and said, smooth as cream, "Carol's gone, honey. This is our family now." My father stared at his plate. Brett smirked at his phone. And something in me went very still. Because I finally understood what I was to them. Not daughter. Not trustee. Not family. Just a signature they expected to obey on cue. The problem was, I had read that trust too many times. And a formality was the one thing I was never going to be. The whole mess broke open 2 weeks before their scheduled closing date. What I didn't know walking into that dinner was that they had already put down $15,000 in earnest money on the Cedar Street house. They had already spent confidence like cash. Sharon pushed the sales packet across the table and tapped the signature line with one perfect fingernail. "We just need this," she said. "Closing is the 18th. My father finally looked up and said, "Dale drew it up." Dale Prout, my father's golf buddy for 20 years, also, inconveniently, a lawyer. I kept my voice even. I'm not signing this tonight. Sharon smiled, but only with her mouth. Why not? Because this is trust property, I said. There's a process. Appraisal, notice, valuation, documentation. I can't just sign land away because somebody wants a faster timeline. I turned to my father. And honestly, Dad, you shouldn't want me to. That was the moment. That tiny, awful moment where I still believed he might back up. He didn't. The kitchen went quiet except for the clock over the stove. Brett muttered that I always thought I was better than everyone. Sharon laid down her fork. So you're willing to hold up your father's whole life over paperwork? I answered the only way I could. Over Mom's instructions, that's not the same thing. My father said nothing. That silence did more damage than the rest of it. I set the pen beside the papers. Thanked her for dinner. Then I drove 12 dark miles back to town with the headlights carving up the county road and didn't cry once because crying wasn't going to reconcile anything. The next morning at 6:40, my father called while I was parked outside my office with the lights still off. I missed it. It went to voicemail. And that was the message I opened this story with. Yolanda, we talked it over. You're out. Don't come back. We're moving forward without you. Then Sharon in the background, half muffled. Tell her about the trust. A pause. Then my father again, lower this time. We'll deal with the trust. Click. There is a kind of stillness that comes over a person when somebody they love hands them a sentence they can never take back. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't call. I read the words again in my head, the same way I read every ugly letter that ever came across my desk, looking for what it meant underneath what it was trying to sound like. We'll deal with the trust. As if it belonged to them. As if my mother's instructions were an inconvenience they could muscle through once I was emotionally cornered enough. I typed one word. Okay. And I want to be clear about something. That was not surrender. People hear okay and imagine collapse. Mine meant the opposite. It meant I was done rescuing people who had just told me in a recorded message that I no longer belonged to them. For 30 months, I had been holding my family together with errands, signatures, patience, money, time, and the kind of loyalty that asks for very little in return. That morning, before sunrise, they broke it themselves. So I stopped holding. And when you stop carrying something that heavy, the first thing you do is set it down. I just happened to be carrying more than they realized. Before noon that day, I did 3 things. First, I withdrew the $60,000. It was still my money, sitting in my account, not transferred, not committed in writing, not gone. I sent Dale a brief email informing him that my proposed personal contribution toward the down payment was withdrawn effective immediately. Then I called my bank and confirmed that not $1 had moved. Second, I formalized the trust process. I notified Gwen Hollies that I was proceeding with appraisal and review exactly as the trust required. No rushed sale, no closing date panic, no shortcuts because somebody else had overpromised. Third, I stopped answering my phone. That was not pettiness. That was oxygen. I had payroll due by 3 and a feed store that did not care about my personal collapse. Life, unlike family, keeps its appointments. When I finally turned my phone back over that afternoon, I had 46 missed calls. 31 from my father. 9 from a number I didn't know. The rest from Sharon. And 1 text from Dale that read, "We have a serious problem. Call me before you do anything else." I stood behind my counter with a customer's paperwork still in my hand and almost laughed. He wasn't wrong. There was a serious problem. He just had the ownership of it backwards. A man who tells his daughter she is no longer family 12 hours before he needs her signature and her money to close on a house definitely has a problem. It just wasn't mine. I finished my client's taxes, walked her to the door, poured myself fresh coffee. And for the first time in 2.5 years, I took a full breath all the way down. Then I called my own lawyer. Not Dale. Never Dale. In small towns, people get sloppy about who represents whom. They talk like all lawyers are just referees standing in the middle of the room waiting to make it fair. They are not. Dale was my father's man. Gwen Holly's was mine. Gwen had helped my mother create the trust. She was in her 60s, wore her gray hair in a braid, and had the sort of calm that makes foolish people louder because they can feel themselves being measured accurately. I laid out everything for her. The pot roast dinner. The voicemail. The $60,000. The pressure. The trust. She listened all the way through without interrupting. Then she folded her hands and said, "Let me tell you exactly where you stand." She told me the money was mine until it left my account, and I had every legal right to withdraw it. She told me that as trustee, I was not only permitted to slow down a trust land sale, I was obligated to do so if the process wasn't being followed correctly. Then she paused, looked at the trust binder and said, "There's one more thing." My mother, the day she signed the trust, had left a sealed side letter with the firm. Writ in her own hand. Dated. Signed. To be delivered to me only if a dispute ever arose over the land. Gwen slid the envelope across her desk. I didn't open it. Not that day. And it mattered that I waited. Because first, Sharon came to my office. Of course she did. Friday at lunch, when she knew the waiting room would be full. The bell over the door rang, and there she was in a coat too expensive for our town and a face already arranged for a scene. "Well," she said loudly enough for everybody to hear, "here she is, the daughter who abandoned her grieving father over dirt." 3 clients were in my office. Not one of them looked up right away, which in a town like mine means all 3 were listening with their whole souls. I said, "Hi, Sharon, can I help you with something?" "You can sign the papers," she snapped. "That's what you can do. You're destroying this family." Then she said the line she loved most. "This is our family now." I came around the counter, opened the door, and said, as calm as I've ever said anything, "If you'd like to discuss trust matters, Gwen Hollies can schedule a meeting with counsel present, but you're not doing this here." She left angry and loud. The bell rang behind her, like nothing at all had happened. And then Mrs. Tilden, who had buried 2 husbands and was frightened by absolutely nobody, looked at me from the waiting chair and said, "Your mama would be proud of you." Small towns talk. I let them. By Sunday, half the county had heard Sharon's version. By Monday, the other half had heard Mrs. Tilden's. My father's messages changed after that. Less anger. More guilt. Which is harder, if I'm honest. He left one voicemail late Sunday night, voice cracking halfway through. "You're tearing this family apart. Your mother would be ashamed. We raised you better than this." That one hurt. There is no version of being grown enough, strong enough, or legally correct enough that makes it painless to hear your father use your dead mother as a weapon. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and listened to it twice. I wanted to call him back. I wanted to fix it. That had been my role for so long that my hands nearly reached for the phone on their own. But when your hands are shaking, you do not make the entry from memory. You go back to the source document. So I got up. I took out the trust. And I read it again. Line by line. My mother's instructions in plain language. No drama. No performance. Just duty. And that steadied me more than any pep talk could have. I wasn't being cruel. I was being correct. Those are not the same thing, no matter how loudly somebody wants them to be. I sent my father one line. "I love you. I'm still following Mom's trust." He never answered. While all of this was happening, their plan was quietly collapsing under its own weight. Without my $60,000 and without trust money, they were short. Badly short. And the sellers of the Cedar Street house had no patience. Their agent sent word. Close on the 18th or forfeit the $15,000 earnest money. My father did not have $15,000 to lose. Almost none of this plan had ever been funded by his own money in the first place. It was supposed to be financed by my gift and land that was never his to liquidate on demand. I heard most of the fallout from Aunt B, my mother's younger sister, who kept checking on him because some people are built kind all the way down even when they are angry. "He's not sleeping," she told me. "Sits out on the porch with the radio off. Sharon's hounding him about the money and Brett's useless." That tug in me came back hard. Because he was still my father. And he was suffering. And I had spent 30 months translating his suffering into work. But here is what I finally understood. I had not caused this. They built a purchase plan around money that wasn't theirs, a sale that wasn't approved, and a daughter they assumed would fold under pressure. Then they tried to throw that daughter away before the paperwork was dry. That wasn't my doing. That was theirs. A week after the voicemail, Gwen called and told me it was time to read the letter. I drove over after work. The envelope was plain white, softened at the corners from sitting in a file for years. My name was written across the front in my mother's careful slanted handwriting, the same hand that had signed my school notes and grocery lists and treatment calendars. I turned it over in my hands and asked Gwen, why did she think this would happen? Gwen took off her glasses and said, "Because your mother was sick, not blind. She knew your father, she loved him, and she knew exactly what loneliness could make him vulnerable to." Then I opened it. It was one page, written front and back in blue ink. She started the way she always started. "No fuss. Yolabug, if Gwen is handing you this, then it happened. And I'm sorry I'm not there to stand in the doorway with you." I had to stop reading for a minute. Then I kept going. She wrote that she had not made me trustee because I was the smart one, though she said I was. She made me trustee because I was the only one in the family who could say no to my father and still love him in the same breath. She wrote that someday someone would come along wanting to turn the land into cash, and they would reach him when he was lonely, tired, or afraid. Then came the part that knocked the air out of me. She told me her own mother had lost her father's farm that exact same way. A second husband, kitchen table pressure, smiles, urgency, one bad signature, gone. My mother had been carrying that history quietly her entire life. She wrote, "Keep the place whole, baby. Not because dirt matters more than people. Because someday somebody in this family will need one thing that didn't get sold in a weak season." Then, near the end, her handwriting pressed darker. "The day they tell you that you're not family for doing the job I trusted you with, that's the day you'll know I was right to choose you. Family doesn't throw you out for protecting what was put in your care. So don't you dare feel guilty. You are not the one who left." I read it 3 times. And something in me that had been crouching for months finally stood up straight. My mother had seen the shape of this long before I did. She hadn't just handed me legal authority. She had handed me permission. After that, Dale's threats lost a lot of their power. When he sent a formal letter claiming my father might petition the court to remove me as trustee, I took it straight to Gwen. She read it, set it down, and said, "Good. Now they've finally shown their hand." She explained what it actually takes to remove a trustee. Not hurt feelings. Not impatience. Not family gossip. Cause. Self-dealing, bad faith, theft, mismanagement, refusal to follow the instrument. I had done none of those things. If anything, I was the only person in the entire situation behaving like the documents mattered. Then Gwen said something that settled the whole thing for me. "The serious problem isn't you," she said. The serious problem is that your father signed a purchase agreement based on money that was never committed in writing. That's his exposure, not yours. That was the moment the numbers balanced in my head. All month I had been carrying this low-grade fear that maybe somehow I was the villain because I was the one saying no. But the ledger didn't support that story. So Gwen and I made one more offer. A fair one. In writing. I offered to consider a proper partial sale of a defined back parcel, not the home place, not my mother's row of oaks, with a full appraisal and all trust procedures followed. I also stated that supporting suitable housing for my father could be discussed through the trust once everything was done correctly. I asked for only two things in return: that the campaign to remove me stop, and that the talk about me no longer being family end immediately. The response came back through Dale, but it had Sharon all over it. No. Not a counteroffer. Not a discussion. Just no. Because they would not accept conditions from me. That told me everything. This had never really been about housing. It was about submission. 3 days before the closing date they were about to miss, Dale called a meeting at his office to resolve everything before it got out of hand. Which, translated from lawyer, meant, my clients are about to lose $15,000 and I need your signature in a room. I agreed to come. Not because I had to. Because I wanted witnesses. I wanted one clean, public moment where the truth stood up in a room and everybody had to look at it with the lights on. I laid out my navy blazer the night before and tucked my mother's letter into the breast pocket. My father called around 11 that night. I almost let it ring. But some doors, even when you're done walking through them, you still keep a hand on. His voice was wrecked. "Yola," he said, "I don't know how we got here." For one brief second, it was just him again. My dad, the man who taught me to drive, the man who cried at my mother's grave until Aunt Bee had to walk him back to the truck. Then he said, "I miss your mother every day. I just need this to close, please." And I almost gave way. Then he added, "If you had just signed the first time, none of this would be happening. You did this to us." And there it was. No apology. Just an invoice made out in my name for a debt that belonged to him. I said, "I love you, Dad. I'll see you at 10. Then I hung up. And I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Because calm is not what happens when nothing is wrong. Calm is what remains when you've already decided. The next morning, I built my file the way I build every file for a hard meeting. Clean. Ordered. No surprises. Trust document. Appraisal notice. Timeline. My withdrawal of the $60,000. Gwen's summary of the law. And in my pocket, separate from the file, my mother's letter. Not evidence. Ballast. Dale's conference room had a long, polished table, trying very hard to look important. When Gwen and I arrived 5 minutes early, I saw immediately that Dale had stacked the room. My father at the far end. Sharon beside him in a red blazer. Brett against the wall. Dale at the head. And two people I hadn't expected, the bank loan officer and the seller's real estate agent. The moment I saw them, something in me settled. Because Dale thought he had brought pressure. What he had actually brought was neutral witnesses. I sat down. The room had that stale, overconditioned office smell and a bowl of mints nobody would touch. Dale opened with exactly the tone you imagine. "Yolanda," he said, "you've created quite a situation." He laid out the case like a man giving closing arguments to a jury he assumed already agreed with him. My father and Sharon had entered a binding agreement in good faith. I, as trustee, had undermined it. I had withdrawn a committed contribution at the 11th hour. I had exposed the family to financial harm. Now, if I would simply authorize the parcel sale and reinstate my contribution, everything could be resolved cleanly. Otherwise, they would proceed with removing me as trustee. Then he added, "That's not a fight you want." Sharon nodded, as if he were reading scripture. Brett smirked. The seller's agent watched without expression. The bank officer looked like a man wishing very sincerely to be somewhere else. The easiest thing in the world, in that moment, would have been to reach for the pen. Not because they were right. Because exhaustion can look a lot like agreement from a distance. But I had a letter in my pocket from a woman who saw this day coming before any of us did. So I opened my own file. And I said, very quietly, "I'm not authorizing the sale today." Then I laid out the facts one page at a time. I explained the trust required an appraisal and notice before any sale. I showed that process had already begun. I showed that I had not refused a lawful sale. I had refused an improper one. Then I laid down the email, withdrawing the $60,000. "My personal money," I said. "Never transferred, never committed in writing. You cannot interfere with a transaction by declining to give away your own money." Gwen added, dry as winter, "A trustee following the trust instrument and a private citizen declining to make a gift are both acting fully within their rights." The bank officer gave the tiniest nod before he caught himself. Then I set the last page on the table and said, "Here is the actual problem. Somebody signed a $240,000 purchase agreement based on funds that did not belong to him and had not been secured in writing. That was never my obligation. That was your risk." The room changed. You could feel it. Like temperature dropping. Dale's face darkened. Before he could recover, Sharon stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. All the polish came off at once. She slapped her palm down on the table hard enough to rattle the mint bowl and said, voice shaking, "Your mother is dead, Yolanda. Dead. This is our family now, and you are not going to ruin it." Silence. Absolute silence. The seller's agent stopped writing. The bank officer froze. And my father looked at me for the first real time that day. I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I think that was the moment the room turned, because fury always looks uglier next to stillness. I said, "You're right. My mother is gone. I know that. I was there." Then I looked at my father. And that is exactly why her trust answers to me. She wrote it that way while she was alive, on purpose. Sharon opened her mouth, then shut it. I kept my eyes on my father. "You left me a voicemail," I said. "You told me I was out. You told me not to come back. You said you were moving on without me." I let the next words land softly, because truth doesn't have to shout. "So I did, Dad. I moved on first." He stared at the table. "You cannot throw your daughter out at sunrise and still expect to own her by noon." There was no answer to that. Brett had stopped smirking entirely. Sharon stood there breathing hard, suddenly aware she had become the loudest person in a room that no longer belonged to her. Then I did the thing that surprised them most. I offered them a fair path one last time. On the record. In front of everybody. I slid the written offer to the center of the table. "Here it is again," I said. "A proper appraised partial sale through the trust for suitable housing for my father. The home place stays intact. The oak trees stay. The campaign against me stops. The talk about me not being family stops today. This is fair. It may be more than a judge would require. Take it, and we all go home lighter." The room waited. The bank officer leaned forward. For 1 second, I thought my father might choose dignity over pride. Then Sharon said, low and tight, "We are not taking conditions from her." And my father, given one more chance to choose his daughter or his silence, said nothing. Again. That was the answer. The deal was dead. The earnest money was gone. The Cedar Street house would pass to somebody else. And none of it was because I had destroyed anything. It was because I had stopped volunteering to be used as mortar. I closed my folder, stacked my papers neatly, stood up. At the door, I looked back once at the people who had told me I was out, and I gave them the same word I had texted from my truck that morning weeks before. Okay. Then I left. Outside, the spring sunlight looked almost too clean after that room. Gwen came out behind me, pulled on her gloves, and said, after a long silence, "Your mother would have liked that." I sat in my truck with both hands on the wheel and waited to feel shattered. Some of that came, sure. You don't watch your father choose pride over you and feel nothing. But what I felt more than grief was lightness. The kind that reaches all the way down into your bones. The Cedar Street purchase collapsed. My father and Sharon lost the $15,000 earnest money and got hit with additional costs besides. Dale never filed the petition to remove me as trustee. There was nothing to put in it that wouldn't embarrass him in front of a judge. The farm stayed whole. The 160 acres remained in trust. The farmhouse remained standing. My mother's oak trees stayed exactly where she planted them. My father still lives there, by the way. The trust supports him because that was always part of the job, and I never confused boundary with cruelty. Even on the day he forgot to be fair to me, I didn't stop being fair to him. By the end of summer, Sharon and Brett were gone. I heard the marriage didn't last long without the porch she'd been promised. Turns out some people don't fall in love with a man. They fall in love with a plan. Aunt B still brings casseroles I do not need and stories I do. The Methodist ladies mostly came back around, the way people do in small towns once the truth has had a full season to settle into the ground. As for my father and me, we speak now and then. Short calls. On my terms. With careful weather between us. It isn't what it was. It may never be. But I sleep through the night now. And my books balance. And the land my mother asked me to protect is still there for whoever comes next needing proof that not everything has to be sold off in a bad year. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. When people mistake your calm for weakness, you do not owe them a correction. Calm is what strength looks like after the decision has already been made. That's my story. One voicemail. One word back. And a piece of land my mother knew I would keep whole. If this hit home for you, if you've ever been called cruel for finally holding a line, take that as your reminder. A boundary is not betrayal. Sometimes it is the most loving thing left to do. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.